Hi everyone, it's Mr. Driscoll again. Welcome to part 2 of our Conflict in the Middle East screencast. Okay, in the last part of the screencast we discussed what happened in the lead up to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. In this part of the screencast we will touch on those issues, but we'll also take a look at some of the other ongoing crises in the region, such as what's going on in Iran, Afghanistan, Iraq, U.S. involvement, and also we'll finish up by taking a look at Islamic fundamentalism and some of the viewpoints there and the roles of women. Okay, so the main idea for this screencast is the turmoil in the Middle East continues to the 21st century. It continues to today. For instance, things have probably changed in the Middle East from the time I recorded this today to the time you're watching it. Okay, it's on a daily basis these things are changing, and hopefully for the better towards more peaceful outcomes. Okay, so we're going to go back to 1964 when the Palestinian Liberation Organization was created. That was made to represent the Palestinian interests. If you remember, they weren't given their own nation state. Okay, they didn't have their own nation state in 1964. So the PLO was an organization to speak for them. It was actually Egyptians who took the lead on this. They actually weren't even in the Israeli territory. Okay, PLO political leader Yasser Arafat, pictured to the right, he headed a guerrilla movement called Al-Fatah. Okay, so the Fatah was, they were the armed resistance movement, or the armed wing of the PLO, and a lot of times they led to violent acts. Okay, the Palestinian Arabs became increasingly frustrated. By the 1980s, they led the Intifada. Okay, the Intifada is another word for an armed uprising in Israeli territories. We can see in the pictures to the right there. Okay, a lot of this wasn't anything more than people congregating in the streets and throwing rocks. Okay, but sometimes it did escalate into more violent situations where many people were killed on both sides. Okay, through the Oslo Peace Accords, that's when international groups stepped up and tried to create a peace settlement between the two different groups. Okay, Israel agreed that the PLO would control a semi-independent area within the Israeli territory, and in return the PLO would recognize the legitimacy of the Israeli nation. However, the peace didn't last very long. After that, about a decade of conflict ensued until 2005. Israel finally had to withdraw from Gaza. But after that, Hamas came to power. Okay, in 2006, they were elected by a majority members of their party. The problem with this was that Hamas, part of their party platform, was the destruction of Israel, or they didn't recognize Israel as a nation, which made it created another wedge in the issue of trying to make peace in that region. Okay, Hamas did work to some degree with the Israelis, but something else that made it even tougher was that there was a radical Islamist group headed in Lebanon to the north, and they were called Hezbollah. Okay, and Hezbollah was sending rocket fire into Israel until finally there was a ceasefire in 2008 between those two groups. But even up until today, there's no real peace settlement or peace agreement, and both sides are really literally fighting it out to the death over this issue of land in Palestinian statehood. Okay, let's shift gears to Iran. Iran's in the news a lot. How did it get to the point where it is? Well, we're going to start with the Islamic Revolution. Okay, what happened was the Shah, who was the leader of Iran at the time, he was very secular. He was allied with the United States, and he had a lot of opposition within Iran against him. The person who led that opposition was called Ayatollah Khomeini. He led a Islamic revolution which toppled the Shah and his government. Okay. One of the main things they opposed was not only corruption, but they thought that the Shah and leaders like him, they promoted like a materialist or immoral society, and that Iran was drifting towards that. So when Khomeini came to power, he was the exact opposite, the conservative pullback against that. Okay, in 1979, he implemented an Islamic republic and restored Islamic law. In a way, it became a theocracy, okay, a country run by religious law. Militants had held 52 Americans hostage in the U.S. Embassy for over a year, so we had very strained relationships between the United States and Iran during this time. We still do. Okay, after Khomeini's death, some Iranians pushed for reforms, and in 2005, a new president, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, was elected. Some background on him. Well, he's crazy. Okay, he's an extremist, he vowed the destruction of Israel, and probably his most controversial statement he's ever made, and he's made several times, is that he denied that the Holocaust ever happened. He says that it was, a story contrived by the West as a way to have the Israeli people get the Jewish people to get Israel. So he's a nut job. Another thing that really scares the other parts of the world is that it really seems like he's dead set on creating a nuclear weapons program. He claims it's for peaceful purposes, but most people agree that they're doing it to create some type of nuclear weapon similar to North Korea. Okay, now let's go to Iraq. Saddam Hussein, which you probably have heard of, very familiar name, he started leading Iraq beginning in 1979. Now, it was always a very tough situation there because, as you can see in the right, the Shias in the Middle East, they were about 89-90% Shia in Iran, 60% Shia in Iraq. But Saddam Hussein was a Sunni. Okay, so there were a lot of people in his government that were in opposition in many ways to the people that he was actually ruling. So he ended up going to war, because remember, he was a Sunni. He went to war against Iran. They had a long, tense conflict, a lot of atrocities at that time. There are stories that Saddam Hussein was using children to clear minefields, and and that he gassed his own people. He gassed the Kurds in the north. He had some poison gas to kill them. Some of that was probably played up a little bit in the media, but for the most part, he did a lot of things that I guess we'd say are Machiavellian. Okay, the ends justifying the means, regardless of how evil they might have been. In 1980, that's when the official war between Iran and Iraq started. In 88, they had a ceasefire, but they actually didn't resolve many of their issues. A lot of the reasons that they originally went to war were never really addressed in that ceasefire. In 1990, Saddam Hussein sent troops into Kuwait. That was on the southern border, and the United States got involved. That was known as the Persian Gulf War. The United States led an international coalition that freed Kuwait and hoped that Hussein would be overthrown. We imposed international sanctions, economic sanctions, but the overthrow never actually happened. He decided not to go in and invade at that point, hoping he would be overthrown, but his people never were able to. Okay, in 1979, the Soviets invaded Afghanistan and occupied the country for 10 years. Okay, so we shifted to Afghanistan. Now, this is where things got tricky. If you remember, during the Cold War era, we were enemies with Russia. So, if Afghanistan was in a conflict with the Soviets, okay, who do you think we backed? Well, it was the Afghanis. Okay, so the United States and Pakistan supported anti-communist rebels, such as the Taliban, who eventually ousted the Soviet Union. They pushed them back. So again, the United States backed people like the Taliban leaders. Now, they took control of Kabul in 1996, and 2 years later they controlled two-thirds of Afghanistan. Now, as this was going on, another group called Al-Qaeda was developing, it was coming together, led by Osama bin Laden. I'm sure you've heard that name. And they recruited Muslims to drive Westerners out of the Muslim nations, and eventually created this doctrine of terrorism towards the West, or anything that represented Western values and culture. Okay, an event I'm sure all of you are very familiar with. Osama bin Laden attacks the United States on September 11th, 2001. You've all seen the pictures, you've seen the video. I don't need to go into it in too much detail here, but that attack, okay, prompted two U.S. responses. Okay, the immediate one was the war in Afghanistan. Okay, we lead a coalition of forces against the Taliban, drive them out of power, and take over Afghanistan. Now, the Taliban was replaced in 2001 by a moderate government. The problem is that it's such a fractured nation. The new government that was put in with U.S. backing has never really been able to get firm control over the country. Okay, so that's posed a huge problem for us. We're still there. Okay, we went to war in 2001. We're still there today. We just signed an agreement that we're going to provide military support until 2024. Okay, so it doesn't look like we're going to be out of there for a long time. It's already the longest war in U.S. history. Okay, now going back to Iraq. In 2002, U.S. President George Bush threatened to remove Saddam Hussein, saying that they had chemical and biological weapons. of mass destruction. They also thought they had a nuclear program going. They were developing a nuclear weapon and that they could use it against allies of the United States or us ourselves. They also said that there was some connection between Saddam Hussein and Al-Qaeda. So in 2003, mostly U.S.-led invasion. We didn't get much support from other nations in this, but we invaded Iraq and captured Saddam Hussein. Okay, the military operations were relatively quick to take over the country, but that was just the tip of the iceberg. Okay, it quickly turned into a bloody, violent civil war that really got out of hand and beyond the U.S. control. Because again, it wasn't necessarily them just fighting us, they were fighting each other. The Sunnis and Shiites were fighting for power within Iraq. Okay. On top of that, Islamic militants were flooding into the country who were anti-American and attacking us as well. Okay, so we were just stuck in the middle of this huge conflict for several years. Now, a new Iraqi government was formed in 2005, but again, the conflict between the Shias, the Sunnis, the ethnic Kurds, and then outside influence was making it a real mess. So in 2007, President Bush's second last year in office, he called for an increase in U.S. soldiers to help end the violence. This was known as the troop surge. At this point, there was a lot of opposition in the United States to this war because, again, we didn't find any evidence of the WMDs, okay, or the weapons of mass destruction, as they were termed. There was no Al-Qaeda connection. It seemed like the U.S. was falling back on this "we need to promote democracy" argument. So people were getting a little tired of this war even before then. But in hindsight, it looks like this troop surge did work. After that, there was more stability in the region, and eventually in 2011, President Barack Obama ordered a complete withdrawal of combat troops. Do we still have troops there? Yes. Okay, there's a lot of troops there. I think the numbers are roughly 50,000. But they're not there for combat. They're technically there to train and provide security for the Iraqi military. So there is some silver lining there. The combat operations, or the official combat operations, have come to an end as of now. Okay, society and culture. Islamic fundamentalism. Okay, you may have heard of that. That's one of the driving forces in this region. They've impacted Middle Eastern women, men as well, obviously, and also has had an influence outside of the Middle East regarding their values. Okay, when Ayatollah Khomeini came into power, we mentioned this briefly earlier, there was a return to traditional Muslim beliefs, clothing style, social practices, legal system, and they also had an extreme opposition to what they considered a Western focus on materialism, greed, and immorality. Okay? Now, of course, this was all from their perspective, but that's the line that they gave. That's what they were telling their people. Okay, early Muslim women participated in government and held many social rights, but this new revolution, the Iranian Revolution, the trend has been towards taking away rights from women. Okay? The burqa is controversial. Some people defend it, saying that the burqa does not, or the head coverings and body coverings do not take away women's rights, but I would say most people say that that is a violation of women's rights. Okay, in the beginning, in the 1970s, again, that was a shift towards more traditional roles for women, which is, of course, very controversial. Now, we didn't get to go into too much depth on any of these issues. For instance, what's going on in Afghanistan now, what's going on in Iraq now, Iran, what's their nuclear weapons program looking like? Is Israel having a covert war, killing scientists to try to keep this from happening? There's a lot that we could go into, but that's why I think this going to be such a great unit. We're going to have some time for you to choose some of these topics and look in a little bit more depth and see how they're working, what's the historical significance, and then where we go from here, okay, as Americans, as citizens, and as part of this international community. All right, if you have any questions, again, please let me know either online or in person in class. Hope you enjoyed the screencast, and take care.